Our next speaker is Jelena. She is a researcher and a professor. She teaches brain-computer interfaces, robotics, and physiological computing at the University of Belgrade. In her talk, Jelena will demystify the technology behind BCIs, explaining the mechanisms of non-invasive systems, and addressing important neuroethical considerations. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome for Jelena.
Hi. I would like to thank the organizers for letting me talk to you today. I'm really happy to share my knowledge in brain-computer interfaces. It's been something that I've been doing since 10 years now, or even more. So hopefully, at the end of my talk, you will understand more about the underlying principles of these technologies. That works. So a few words about myself. I did a PhD in computer science, specifically in brain-computer interfaces, in 2 national research centers in France. They're quite known, maybe you know, INRIA and INSERM. INSERM is more about it's more about like health and medical sciences, and INRIA is more about computer science and mathematical models and so on. Okay. Then I was a research fellow in Reichman University, where I worked on different physiological devices, physiological signals, decoding them, and also developing different virtual reality environments, bringing all that together and trying to create, more innovative human-computer interactive systems, okay? Intangible interfaces and so on. Today, I'm an associate professor at the School of Computing in Belgrade, and I introduced 2 new courses called Brain-Computer Interface and Physiological Computing. I also teach robotics, and I also teach information retrieval, actually. Today, I'll talk about the ongoing projects on the brain, from research to companies, how it transferred to the companies, and I thought maybe you would be interested in the market value of neurotech. Hopefully, you like that information. So brain-computer interfaces are often exaggerated in the media, so you think that you can read minds and so on with these technologies, but it's not really true, so I'll tell you what is actually happening in reality. And yeah, in a few slides, I will try to explain how BCI works, and if you want to start, inventoring yourselves and start working on a BCI, give you some guidelines. And if you go down that path, you should consider, all of these ethical concerns that are about neurotechnologies, because as inventors and scientists and engineers, we always need to think about the societal impact of our creations. So the most known projects on the brain are, for example, the European Blue Brain Project. It's been going on for 2 decades now, and they created a lot of digital tools to analyze and simulate brain activity. Then there is this Obama Brain Initiative, for example, in the USA. It's still ongoing. And all of these projects, they catalyzed major international collaborations between scientists, which resulted in a huge increase in publications in neuroscience and in innovations in general. So it also boosted fields such as connectomics, in which we build a 3D model of the brain, so using very advanced, I'm posing for the photo, sorry, very advanced brain imaging techniques. And they also use, for example, graph theory in order to explain the function of the brain using these connectomes, so-called connectomes. Then there is this other field or project that's been boosted by these aforementioned projects called Brainbow, which is basically a visualization technique in which scientists genetically modify the brain in the embryo. So when the neurons are born, right, they appear in different color. And this different color is based on their functionality. So in this way, because it's not white or gray matter, we can actually easily differentiate these colors and understand function through structure. Another field that gained a lot of attention is called optogenetics. Again, the brain is modified to be sensitive to light. Typically, you probably know that the brain is sensitive only to neuromagnetic impulses and not light. So they're actually genetically modifying the brain so it's sensitive to light. And so what they do to these mice, they, for example, send blue light or red light, and it inhibits or induces a certain behavior, motor behavior. Last but not least, the one that gained a lot of attention is brain-computer or machine interface, in which it's a system that enables us to interact with the machine using only neural activity. So 3 key words in brain-computer interfaces is measure, control, and real time. Measure brain activity, of course, with different measuring devices, measuring techniques. We control an external device or some motors in a robotic limb or video game or whatever. And this happens, importantly, this is important, that it happens in real time, meaning that we have a closed loop interaction. So it feels very natural. What that means is that we're sending neural data continuously to the machine, and it's continuously being decoded and translated into some command, okay, in real time. And so it feels as if we had an extension of our central nervous system. It feels like having an extension of our own limbs. Because it's in real time, it's very natural. So you have 2 major currents in BCI. It's even, maybe you can say, opposing views on how to conduct experiments. So one group of researchers, they use non-invasive BCI, meaning that they think that you don't need to operate on the brain in order to measure brain activity. And the other ones, in order to get clearer signal from the brain, they want to operate, and the deeper you go in the brain, the more accurate signal you can get. Let's talk about a few words of invasive BCI. Invasive means you need to operate on the brain. So invasive has like these 3 major techniques of measuring brain activity. For example, ECOG, or electrocorticography, is this patch that's placed on the cortex. There's electrodes inside, and it doesn't penetrate the protective layers of the brain. It just sits there. It's less invasive than the microelectrode arrays, which are really touching neurons and brain tissue. And the depth of these microelectrode arrays can vary. And then the last quite novel technique is to place this measuring sensor inside of a blood vessel through a catheter. So it's like a stent, and it's called a stentrode because it's an electrode and a stent. And it's actually least invasive, and it gets quite good signal from the brain. And this research that started in Australia translated to a company called Synchron, which is now in New York. And in 2021, they started working with paralyzed patients, and these patients were able to manipulate, some applications on the computer successfully. Then you have electrocorticography. For example, again, a paralyzed patient was able to move an exoskeleton only using his brain activity. But you can see here that, this whole armature, this exoskeleton is actually connected to the ceiling, so it's quite a heavy mechanism, right? You have then microelectrode arrays again, and this is, this very dense populated number of electrodes, a lot of electrodes, and they are deep inside the brain. They can record and stimulate electrically the brain. So what happens is, for example, in a subretinal space, this microelectrode array was placed and also stimulated the optical nerve so that a blind patient could actually recognize letters. This was done in 2009 or something, yeah. Now, talking about stimulation, so there is also something called deep brain stimulation, and this was not considered a BCI before. It started as an idea or as a technology to treat Parkinson's disease, this tremor. So it was only sending electrical impulses that were static, or just sending them. So it's not really a BCI, right? Because what did I say? Do you remember? BCI, you need to measure and control. This wasn't measuring anything. But now, these new devices appear that are closed loop, this Medtronic's Percept, and actually they measure brain activity and they adapt these sending impulses, these signals that they send. They adapt according to the the information that they measure so that they can adapt and better treat the patient. And this is also called brain-computer-brain interface. Why? Well, because we measure the brain and we directly influence the brain with deep stimulation. You probably heard of this, Neuralinks, Elon Musk's and all of these companies. For example, BlackRock Neurotech doesn't have anything to do with the other company called BlackRock. It's just, I don't know why they call it like that. But yeah, they're trying basically to create, smaller and less, let's say, less dangerous devices that also send this data wirelessly. Because as you see, maybe I can go back, wait. As you see here, this patient is actually connected with wires. So the idea is actually to create something that can send wirelessly all the data. Oh, and I just realized that I didn't mention this. So Neuro Therapeutics actually is a really, really new, completely new company, and they really want to push the boundaries. They talk about enhancing memory function. So if someone had traumatic brain injury, they want to send these deep brain stimulations in order to enhance memory loss, to prevent memory loss and enhance memory function. That's really cool and scary. I don't know. Anyways, so and there is also paradromics. So this was an ex-associate of Elon Musk and so on. So all of these guys are invested a lot of money into all these technologies. But what happens? You can imagine, there are a lot of risks of this invasive technology, right? So with ECOG, you have all these bulky wire connections and exposed cortex. With these chips that you put inside of the brain, well, it can degrade because of corrosion, delamination. And it doesn't really last long. And it makes sense for people who really have locked-in syndrome and cannot move or paralyzed and so on, but even that, it lasts 2 or 3 years, and they need to reoperate and to change the tech. So it's a foreign object, and the body is rejecting this chip. So other current, as I mentioned, uses a non-invasive BCI. Non-invasive, this is what you typically see. It's an EEG, or electrocorticography, on the left. And we just measure electrical activity of the brain. So it's naturally there. Nothing is being induced. Just the brain has electrical currents inside, and we are measuring it, okay? What you see after it, in the middle, it's called magnetoencephalography. And basically, where there's electrical current, there is also magnetic field. So we're just measuring magnetic fields. It's a very complex technology, and it's really expensive. I think, in France, there is only one like that. I don't think there is one in Serbia. Then you have a fMRI or MRI machine. You probably saw something like this, maybe went into one. And how it works is basically you have really big magnetic plates that move. And the idea is to measure the amount of oxygen in the blood, in the brain. Why? What's the principle? Why? Well, the idea is if a certain region of the brain is active, it will need more blood and more oxygen. So basically, if you know that there is more oxygen, more blood, that means that this region is active. So the information is coming from a certain region, right? So we can understand what's going on. And so instead of using these huge magnets, you can actually use something that's called near-infrared spectroscopy. As the name says itself, near-infrared means it's using light, near-infrared light. It penetrates the skull. It penetrates tissue. And we can get through light, we know that blood that has a lot of oxygen, it actually, absorbs light more. So oxygen absorbs more light, while deoxygenated blood doesn't absorb light. So you can see, where there is different oxygenated or deoxygenated blood and so on. So this is a nice solution instead of using a huge fMRI. But actually, what we use typically is EEG because it's less expensive, it's portable, and we actually, most of all, are interested in these fast changes in the brain. We really want to know what's going on in the brain, but in order to create this natural interaction with the machine. So we want to have these fast changes, fast information that's coming from the neural activity. I hope it's not too much. I'm just looking here like, it's a lot of information that I'm giving you. Just realize that, okay. Anyways, so what researchers do here in non-invasive technology is that because the signal is really noisy, so they don't place this chip inside the brain, they realize like, okay, the signal is influenced by a lot of external noise, right? You have the power line, which is one typical example. You have like, I don't know, different sounds, lights, and so on. And most of all, there is something that's called the muscle activity. Because actually what we want just to take information coming from the brain. We don't want muscle activity. What's muscle activity? It's also electrical activity. And it pollutes our signal. Specifically, mostly the signals coming from the face. So, how to overcome all of this? So there are four ways. Okay, one way is to create better hardware. Second way is to, delve into signal processing techniques. Okay, let's try to like filter out the signal, how to do this to be more performant and faster computation. And then again, you can use machine learning, right? Because, well, depending on the available data, you can create more or less, you can understand what these signals mean. And you can classify them and say, okay, I can classify this and then translate this into a certain command that will manipulate the machine. You'll see this in a second. And then lastly, what you wouldn't think of is, okay, I can develop the machine, hardware, and the algorithms that are behind, but what about the user? So if the user is confused and think about random thoughts, you can't really decode that signal. It's gibberish. I mean, it's random. So the user actually needs to control a machine using only neural activity. What does that mean? Whoever controlled anything with only their brains? I mean, it's not something you do every day, right? So this is something that you need to learn in order to, control a machine. It's something that we also train users. So I'm just going to mention a few of these techniques that we use in the lab, for example. Here we use a conductive gel. So basically, beneath every of these electrodes, we put this gel, which is basically just salt, to increase the conductivity. And this way, we get a better, clearer signal. But this is not really socially acceptable, right? I mean, you don't want to really have a lot of electrodes and go outside and have this gel and things like it's not really pretty. So there are a lot of companies who, developed different solutions and designs of EEGs. And for example, some of them work on both research-grade EEG and consumer-grade EEG. And this is specifically, I really like this company because also it's from Serbia. And not only that, but they really have really good solutions that are alternatives to medical grade. But they don't have medical certificates, but their signal is quite good. And if you like Belgrade, you can come to their conference that they organize in April 2025. They really bring international researchers, really like top researchers from the field. So you have other companies that work on consumer EEG, and they just focus on consumer EEG. And the cheapest one, if you're interested, is this Muse, for example, from Interaxon. It has only a few electrodes, and you get like, a fairly good signal, but you just get like alpha waves that maybe you've heard of. Alpha waves is signal, a neural activity that is really strong when you like relax or meditate. So you want to increase these alpha waves, and then you can meditate, and then they give you some instructions and so on. So this is like really consumer-grade EEG. And also you can track your sleep behavior so that you can have a better sleep, you can manage your stress, and so on. There's a lot of things going here. And, prices vary. On the other hand, you have EEGs that also offer measuring and stimulation. Stimulation, but non-invasively. So they inject a very weak current, and they try to treat epilepsy or drug addiction or pain. This is really in a trial. Still, it's not really, it's not perfect, let's say. And you probably heard of Brian Johnson, maybe, I don't know. And he invested a lot of money into these combining a hybrid technique, so using EEG and FNIRS. Remember, FNIRS is the one that has light that penetrates, that's called. Which actually, I mean, I didn't try it, but I would like to try it. Looks cool. Well, not really pretty, but it looks cool. Anyways, so you have alternatives on brain-computer interfaces. As you can understand or perceive that there are a lot of difficulties in getting a clear signal and so on. But why do we need to look at the neural signal from the brain, from the source? So Meta, or Control Labs, and Meta just bought Control Labs, Meta abandoned the idea of looking at the brain signals from the brain. Because if we're talking about consumer-grade EEG, these are healthy subjects, so it's not like people who are paralyzed. Why not use electrical activity and read it from a certain limbs? So the electrical activity is a lot stronger if it's read from muscle. And what does it mean? So the brain is sending a motor, through the motor neurons, electrical activity to your hand. So basically, if you put the wristband, you can read this electrical activity, and you can even have more degrees of freedom in controlling something. You can have more commands. From the brain, you need to train a lot, have a lot of training data, noisy, it changes, and so you'll see, I'll talk in a bit about the details. So maybe it's not such a bad idea to, in a consumer grade, think about maybe other solutions. So just to tell you about the market, Meta spent like $1 billion to get Control Labs in 2019, the ones that made this wristband. Between 2010 and 2020, there are private investments such as from Elon Musk, Brian Johnson, and so on. They invested a lot of money in neurotech. So you might maybe think of using some of these technologies. So next topic is about the exaggerations of the media. I saw I Googled, and then I saw some things like mind-reading technology has arrived, and you don't need to use any more phones. You can just communicate directly with, brain to brain, or again, mind-reading device, telekinesis, and, things like that. Yeah, no, that's not really happening. It's not true. What is true is that we cannot decode, the machine cannot decode some random thoughts. For example, you think about your dog, your family, the beach, you're hungry, your mood, you have some mood swings or whatever, some random or abstract thoughts. The machine cannot decode that. It's no. What we can decode is your reactions to stimuli. So you can, we can see some mappings of the stimuli onto your brain. That's what we can see. And that's actually pretty easy and straightforward. So I wanted to, maybe I can do it from here. Play this video from YouTube. And this guy is actually looking on a screen. And maybe do you see this? There's some flickering lights, white lights. And you have a flickering light left, front, back, and on the right, left, right, right. And so basically, he just focuses on one of these flickering lights. These lights flicker it's known, between 10 or 15 hertz. So it's low frequency. And when you look at something that oscillates between these frequencies, your brain, your neurons in the occipital region start to oscillate in the same frequency. So if you look at 10 hertz, which is the left, for example, left arrow, then your brain will oscillate in 10 hertz, and then it's okay, he wants to go left, right? Okay, this is 14 hertz. This guy's watching on 14 hertz, really focusing on this. Okay, my brain starts oscillating 14 hertz, go to the right. Go straight, go back, and so on. It's really mapping very simple commands to moving different objects and so on. So this is what we can decode, right? We can decode these reactions to stimuli. The other thing that we can, and the stimuli can vary. Of course, there can be sound, visuals, and whatever, okay? But if you just imagine something, you imagine some image, we cannot see the image. We cannot hear this inner voice and so on, okay? How does it work? Oops. Nope. Okay. And the second thing that we can decode are very simple commands that repeat many times. And this is possible because there are very large zones in the brain that control certain things, like hands. So the motor cortex sends these like electrical impulses to your hands. And because we use our hands every day, really often, we have these regions are really developed, and there are a lot of synapses, and a lot of neurons fire at the same time. So because they fire at the same time, and there's a lot of activity like at once, we can measure, we can see this cortical activity and attribute it to left hand movement or right hand movement. So when you move your hands, you know probably that it's contralateral, like left hemisphere controls your right hand and right hemisphere controls your left hand. And so we know that, right? And then you can see all of these signals just because a lot of neurons fire and just because you repeat it a lot, like we train the machine. By the way, the other one, just earlier, we don't need to train the machine. It's just like you just capture what's like your reactions. But here we need to train the machine. And we need to train a lot of times. Okay, so So yeah, you can see this is like the first thing I did in my PhD. I was like, I need to play a video game with my brain. Like everybody thinks that first. So yeah, so this guy is actually imagining to move his left or right hand. Why? Because the same regions are actually active when you move and when you imagine moving. It's the same signal, just weaker, smaller, it's not as amplified. So this guy's imagining to move right hand to move the penguin to the right, and he's moving left, the penguin to go to the left with his left hand. So in reality, we have these two major, this can be divided into reactive BCI and active BCI. There are like a lot of names and paradigms and so on, but this is the basics. And so the machine could decode only what it was previously trained on. So we need training, we need machine learning. Why? Why can't you just plug an EEG and play? Like, here is an EEG, play it with your mind. Yeah, no. Only if it's a stimuli, then yeah, but this in motor imagery, no, it doesn't really happen. Why? Because each person is different. Each person has different morphologies. They have different signals that are really unique to each person, okay? So we need to calibrate the machine to each person. You see the difference? The other one was just mapping in the oscillations. So this is not really unique to a person. This motor imagery is actually, I'm really focusing in trying to move and imagine moving and so on. So it's really kind of unique to myself. It's spontaneous, you know. So the brain, and what's even worse is that the brain, worse or not, it's great. The brain changes all the time. It learns, it adapts. It's like constantly changing. So if we want the machine to learn to decode signals, well, the machine also needs to adapt, right? Because if I have some training data, it lasts for a while, but then the person changed, and I need to recalibrate. I need to retrain my machine learning algorithm, right? So we need to calibrate and recalibrate, and preferably, we would like to have a machine that adapts in the same way as the brain does. That would be cool. And I did that. Anyways, so yeah, let me try to explain how BCI works, like the basics. Maybe you already have some idea, but let me give you some details, because you're probably thinking how do we train the machine? What do you do with this signal? What's this signal? What is she talking about? So, for example, if you place an electrode on your brain, so it's just sitting on your scalp, right? It's just on the skin. And you you imagine, for example, to move your hand, right hand. And you see something like this. With your naked eye, you see like this from the electrode. What's this? And this is just the change in voltage in time. It's current. And probably you have a bunch of electrodes so that you can capture more activity. and you have this, so it doesn't make any sense. And if you want to train your machine, machine learning algorithm, well, you need to tag, in time, this motor imagery signal, like when did it happen, right? So I need to tag my signal somehow, and how do I do that to train the machine, right? So how do I tag this? Well, I tag this by just telling the person to imagine at a certain time. So you just tell them, when you see an arrow showing to the right, imagine right hand movement, and then you tag, you tag it for 4 seconds because you tell them to do 4 seconds. Of course, you can never really know if they really imagined their right hand at that time and not. That's, the difficulties of it, because often when I worked with people, they actually wanted to do the opposite of what I said, just to test the machine. But luckily, I told them, okay, now this is machine learning, the training of the machine. Don't do other things than what I said, okay? Do it later. And, most of them would listen. But, yeah. So do it later. And then you train this for many, many times. You tell them, when you see the right, the arrow on the right, imagine right hand motor imagery. When you see this arrow pointing on the left, imagine left hand motor imagery. And do that for 10 minutes. So it can be really tiring. But yeah, that's what they do. And of course, in a more advanced setting, I wasn't really using these arrows. You can use whatever you want, like something that's maybe more pleasant to the eye. You can play with this. Don't need this kind of interface. And what we know that when a person imagines to move or performs this motor imagery, so-called, it's a motor imagery, we know that when they imagine this, beta waves increase in power and alpha waves decrease in power. You maybe remember a bunch of information I told you. Maybe you remember that I said that alpha waves actually increase when you're relaxed. So it makes sense that this decreases when you're actually trying to perform an activity, right? And beta is like, yeah, let's do this activity. Anyways, this is an oversimplification of brainwaves. But yeah, we're interested in between these hertz between 8 and 35 hertz. So we can just filter out everything else, right? Just take it out. And then we can also filter out some electrodes. We can perform some subtractions and see, okay, maybe just these that are around the motor cortex is what I need so that I can reduce the dimensionality, so that I don't need to calculate so many data in every millisecond. It's a lot of data, so you don't want to, it's very expensive. And so I have this numerical value every 16th of a second that I feed my machine learning algorithm, for example. So what happens here, I'm just going to remind you, we measure brain activity continuously. We're filtering these signals. I know something about these signals, but also this can also be learned. So it depends. There are a lot of techniques. And then I feed some data to my machine learning algorithm. Let's say something very simple like SVM, maybe support vector machines, or LDA, and so on. Really simple things. It's a classifier. So I get these points in space, and then I can just build a hyperplane and divide these two and say, okay, this is for my left-hand motor imagery. I don't know, the red is for my right-hand motor imagery. So I tagged this, I trained my classifier, and now I want the user to use the machine according to these classifiers. So what happens is, okay, so I don't need to tag anymore. I just tell him, okay, now we can finally play. You can finally use the machine. The training is over, just do whatever you want. So that's when they start doing, okay, I'm going to do left when I'm supposed to do right. They start playing. And they realize it actually works. When I actually imagine moving my left hand, it actually does move on the left, and it does move on the right, and to some degree, and so on. But, well, it works for some people. For people who often use, for example, from my experience and from many scientific reports, they say that people who meditate, for example, or sports people and so on, they manage to control it easily. But typically, a novice user that just for the first time uses this system for 10 minutes only, just train the thing, and it's not really going to work, actually. It's not. So, yeah. Why? Because they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know how to control a machine using only brain activity. So I mentioned that earlier. And most of the time it's 60% performance, meaning that 60% of the time the hand or whatever thing will go to the right when intended, and 40% of the time it won't. So people just get discouraged, and oftentimes they're like, this thing doesn't work. I mean, this is stupid. But actually, it does. Like, you just need to have patience. I'm telling you this. I know it's a lot of detail, but I'm telling you this because if ever you try it and it doesn't work, don't be discouraged, okay? And what actually happens is also that the training data was maybe like an hour ago, and you learned, you changed your mood, you're tired, you're like hungry or whatever, or you ate too much or, you know, whatever, and you changed. So again, you actually need to recalibrate, you need to use some tweaks on your machine learning. Anyways, the BCI is a new skill. And what does it mean to motor imagery? What does that mean to perform that? Like, you ask yourselves probably, like, okay, am I supposed to visually imagine myself moving? Am I supposed to visually imagine someone else moving? Am I supposed to, like, feel my limb moving and then just not move? Actually, that's the best way. The best way is to mix all of them, if you can. And basically, it needs to feel really natural, like you want to move, but like you just stop at the last moment, you know? So that's why people who meditate, they do these like body scanning things, you know, body scanning exercises, because they could feel all of these like muscles and limbs, and they focus on their body and so on. So this is like things that you can actually learn and train. And it can actually be really good for your cognition, for your stress and so on. It's shown in a lot of studies. And yeah, we would like, if in order for this to, oh, I see that I'm late. Sorry, I'm really sorry. In order for this to work, we actually need to have a machine that adapts like a brain, and that's what I mentioned I did for my PhD, but I'm going to skip it. So if you want to start, I advise you to try, for example, joining the Neuro Ethics community. Use some maybe simple, for starters, simple EEG devices, just with a few electrodes, just to try and play with it. You have openViBE, which is, you know, an open source tool in which you can even read pre-recorded brain data. You can visualize data. Oh, you wanted to take a photo of this? Yeah, go with it. You can visualize data. You can filter out, and everything that I just mentioned actually is implemented in openViBE. You can actually, there's also machine learning techniques that are implemented. There's filtering techniques. You know, you can choose which channel you want to use and perform some different operations on it. So it's actually really cool. And you don't need to use it only for brain data. You can actually use it for all different kinds of data. Like here, I use it for respiration, which is like electrodermal activity. You can use it for breathing, for EKG. So, and you can just like, at least what you can do is just display it and see how it looks. Just plug your device, send it to openViBE. Now this is the little tweak. How do you send it to openViBE? Most of the times it's like sent with Bluetooth and using a network called lab streaming layer. I'm really sorry, I'm going to try to be fast. So this lab streaming layer is something that is really great. It enables you to send brain data from any kind of device to it, well, any kind of device to any kind of application. So my students are like, first thing that they want to do is create a video game in Unity and then play it with their mind, the same as my reaction was, right? So actually, if they can do it, I think like it's quite easy. I mean, you have all of the tools, a lot of tutorials in this Neuro Ethics community. You can just, they are on Slack, on Discord. You have a lot of posts on a lot of things. And so basically, this, what you can do, you can use this SDK, LSL for Unity. You can just plug it into Unity, and you can just send data from your device to openViBE, which also has LSL, and you can send it from openViBE to your Unity. So in openViBE, you can like filter it and do whatever you want, machine learning and so on. I mentioned Muse, maybe you remember, and there is like, oftentimes consumer-grade EEG is closed, meaning that you cannot see your raw data. Is something I don't really like. Like most of companies, you don't really have access to your own data. And so a lot of there's a lot of hackers and a lot of people in this open science and neurotech community where with LSL you can actually access. So I gave you a few links. You can access your data, your raw data and do whatever you want with it using LSL. Okay, so hopefully that helps. And this is, oh no, I still have something about ethics. So you probably thought of this immediately. Deep brain stimulation, you know, it's like it's an implant inside of your brain that sends electrical impulses. And in Parkinson's disease, when they were treating patients, there were significant alterations in personality. So this is something that really questions the, consent, user consent, and we don't really know. There's a potential erosion in personal identity, and where do thoughts and actions actually come from the device or from the individual, right? So a lot of ethical concerns are here being discussed, and there are a lot of committees that talk about this and even try to push laws. And in Chile, there is under constitutional amendment to have to protect brain data and activity. And so if ever you adventure yourself into making neurotech devices, you should think also about, what happens with all of these data. Because what I just want to mention is, like, there is a minister from Chile that asked one of these companies, I think Emotive, to delete all of his brain data because the data is unique to each individual. So we don't really know what kind of misuse can happen in the future. So, yeah, think about that. Thank you. Sorry for